Today our guest is Mr. Robert Wيلوك, the Regional Manager of Economist Intelligence. We would like to welcome you here, and it's such an honor to interview you here in Kuwait.
Yes, thank you for having me.
You're welcome, it's our pleasure. So today you was a guest in ASAR Conference 2023. We would like to talk more about it, and I would like to ask you a couple of questions regarding the conference. So let's start. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay. The economy is okay?
Sure.
Alhamdulillah. Good news. So the US's Federal Reserve is expected to have an interest rate reduction in the coming year 2024. How do you see the future of the global economy being affected by this?
Sure. So clearly we have had a global environment with very high levels of inflation, and central banks around the world, including the Fed, have responded to those high levels of inflation by tightening monetary policy. In other words, raising interest rates. Now those interest rates have risen to a peak of between 5.25 and 5.5%, which is historically quite high and certainly much higher than the very low interest rate environment we've had for many years. We think now we're at the top of the cycle, we're at the peak. We don't think the Fed or some of the other major central banks like the European Central Bank or the Bank of England, we don't think they're likely to tighten further. So we think that they will pivot as their next move to more loose monetary policy, which means reducing interest rates. Our forecast is that that will probably happen in the second half of 2024. The idea being that by making money cheaper, that will stimulate investment and that will start to allow the global economy to pick up again, but not at a rate that it starts to cause inflationary pressures again. So the reduction of interest rates will be good news for the global economy. That's likely to stimulate economic growth globally. And of course, for the dollar-pegged economies of our region, the GCC economies are either pegged to the dollar directly or, like Kuwait, pegged to a basket of currencies dominated by the dollar. That will also again make money and make borrowing cheaper, which should stimulate investment and stimulate growth.
Let's jump to the second question. So, what is your analysis of Kuwait and the Gulf countries will be affected by the current and ongoing geopolitical events in the region and the world?
Sure. So geopolitics is back in a big way.
Okay.
We have conflicts around the world. In Ukraine, of course, that is ongoing. Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues and shows no sign of coming to an end. Unfortunately. We have all eyes, of course, on the South China Sea. Does China have ambitions to either annex or invade Taiwan? That would be very serious for the world, given America's promise to defend Taiwan. So that's another thing to watch out for. Hasn't happened. Let's hope it doesn't.
Hopefully.
And then, of course, let's talk closer to home. Tragically, we now have war in Gaza. We have Israel's response to Hamas's attacks of the 7th of October, and that brings risk to the Middle East region as a whole. The risks there are of an escalation, of either potentially the involvement of other Iranian proxies. We've already seen, for example, the Houthis attacking shipping now off the coast of Yemen. And given that 10% of global exports go through this region and an even bigger proportion of global oil production goes through this region, of course, if there is disruption to the Strait of Hormuz or access to the Red Sea, then that would cause significant increases in the prices of commodities. So whilst for us in this region, the war in Gaza is a humanitarian disaster, we must also think that there would be significant economic consequences if it escalated or there was wider contagion in the region.
And a very important question we must cover. Kuwait's excessive reliance on oil currently makes up over 90% of its revenues. How do you suggest Kuwait combats and reduces this moving forward?
It's true that Kuwait's economy is over-dependent on oil.
On oil, yeah.
Especially given the energy transition that is starting to take place in the world as countries and certainly businesses aim to move away from hydrocarbons to more clean energy. Mm-hmm. So the urgency for Kuwait of a move away from its overdependence on oil and a move to develop other industries to broaden its economy is significant. It's a challenge that we've already seen being tackled elsewhere in the GCC. If you think about the UAE, that has diversified its economy and now has significantly important sectors such as tourism, such as logistics, such as finance. And this is clearly a template that other countries in the region will look to copy. Now, Saudi wouldn't say that it is copying the UAE, but clearly Saudi is on its own diversification path.
Yeah.
It has its own targets, it has its own vision plan,
right.
And it's on its own journey. It will do it in its own way, and we will see the development of significant tourist industry there, logistics. It's investing heavily in things like electric vehicles, other manufacturing sectors as well. So Kuwait has two neighbours who are already on this journey. Kuwait starts a little bit further from behind, but then clearly has the opportunity to see what its neighbours are doing, to learn from their mistakes, and then to follow its own path towards economic diversification. This is going to be very important. It is unlikely that oil will run out before demand runs out. Yeah. But demand is the problem. Mm-hmm. If global demand for oil, which hasn't yet peaked,
Alhamdulillah, great.
Hasn't yet peaked, but will soon. Then Kuwait needs to make sure it is not stuck on an oil-based economy when demand for oil starts to fall substantially. At the moment, taking place just down the road in Dubai is COP28, and discussions will be taking place there about how the world can reduce its own dependency on hydrocarbons. So these are the conversations that are taking place all around the world. How can we reduce our dependence on oil?
How would you perceive the current growth rates in Kuwait, and do you see that there may be missed opportunities in regards to improving the Kuwaiti economy?
Yeah, and this goes hand in hand with my answer to the previous question. So Kuwait's economy and the shape of its economy largely tracks the price of oil. When oil prices are high, Kuwait's GDP growth is strong. So if you think about 2022, which was a bumper year for the GCC and certainly the oil-producing countries of our region, when oil prices are that high, over $100 a barrel, Kuwait's GDP growth is going to be strong. Mm-hmm. When oil prices are lower, then the risk is that countries like Kuwait are unable to make all of the investments that they want to make in those other areas, in healthcare, in housing, in education, in all those important aspects of society. So I think the oil price is what drives at the moment Kuwait's economy. It needs to get itself to a place whereby swings in the price of oil don't directly affect its growth in the way that they do now. So our oil price forecast for the next few years is for low 80s dollars per barrel, high 70s. Now, that's probably at or around the level that Kuwait needs for fiscal break-even, but much lower than that, and then it will have to start trimming back its spending in order to break even, or to run a deficit, or to borrow. And countries in the GCC have typically been quite reluctant to borrow. So our forecast for Kuwait's economic growth is for about 2% from 2024 out to 2028, 2% per year. That is not spectacular growth. If you consider that the population is going to grow by about 1.5%, that's pretty stagnant. So Kuwait needs to get its growth up above 3% per year in order to get onto a faster growth path. And in order to do that, again, it needs to reduce this reliance on oil, so we come back to the same thing time and time again.
Yes, I got you. Yes, okay. In your opinion, how would you view the current Kuwaiti political situation, and do you think it plays a direct role in the economic situation?
Sure. So, look, when you have arguments between government and parliament, then things don't get done.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
You get this sort of bottleneck effect that makes decision making slow. You have different vested interests either pushing their own agendas or pushing back on governmental agendas. And this just simply means that you get this sort of gridlock in governmental decision making that also therefore frustrates the reforms that are necessary in order to do all the stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Now, elections produce results that sometimes mean that you have a parliament that might be in conflict with the leadership. Now that has to be resolved, or they have to find a way of breaking through that impasse, such that decisions can be made, and we've been talking about them in the conference today, decisions that can be made in the best long-term interests of the country, not necessarily in the short-term interests of, giving public sector workers another pay rise, for example. Now, that's important to public sector workers, of course it is, but the problem and the cycle that we've seen here is that higher oil revenues go to government, government then pays those in subsidies or higher public sector wages to citizens, which is fine, but that's just the same cycle. And actually to break that, then some difficult decisions need to be made, and some brave decisions need to be made in the aspect of the long term. And that's what's going to take political consensus. So that's what at the moment is causing something of a breakdown in the decision making, in the law making that will facilitate some of the decisions and some of the actions that are needed to achieve the bright future that actually Kuwait could have with such a young, well-educated population.
Do you believe that the financial reform are possible in Kuwait given the emphasis on citizens' welfare as a red line?
Yeah, look, again, here's the cycle that we've been talking about. So, Kuwait's economy, in a very simple level, looks like this. Oil revenues flow into government. Government then turns those revenues into subsidies for citizens and public sector pay, which of course is where the majority of Kuwaitis who are in work are employed. So, and you can see how this cycle then works. Now, that of course creates a strong consumer market, because if that money flows to the consumers go out and spend those in stores, physical stores, online stores, they buy new cars, they buy new washing machines. That is good for the economy and that circulates the money.
Yes, true.
But of course, again, for a healthy, sustainable economy, we need a stronger private sector that is generating wealth itself and circulating that wealth through the economy. So, of course, citizen welfare is hugely important, but again, that needs to be balanced against the longer term needs to normalise the economy.
So, the Kuwaiti government recently approved salary increases and benefits. Would you say this is favourable for the current economy?
Well, favourable in the sense that I've just mentioned, in terms of more money in people's pockets to go out and spend in the economy. Of course, making public sector pay increases is also inflationary. If those pay increases are running at a level higher than prices, so if you put an extra 10% on people's salaries, then that will have an inflationary effect, because prices will rise in accordance with higher spending power. So again, the need to provide higher levels of pay for particularly public sector workers needs again to be balanced with the broader needs of the economy. If you end up with a group of very, very highly paid public sector workers who are not generating value to the same degree as their level of pay, then you get a very skewed economy.
Yeah.
And then that will be difficult when, in the future, more people need to be working in the private sector. And if you get out of kilter such that public sector jobs pay much better than private sector jobs, who's ever going to want to move into the private sector?
Yes.
But ultimately, for the long-term success and sustainability of the Kuwaiti economy, it needs a private sector full of talented, clever, motivated Kuwaitis.
So, what's your assessment of OPEC Plus alliance's production reduction policy? And in your analysis, do you see it affecting the income of Gulf countries?
Yeah, of course, and countries like Kuwait in particular. And think back to that point I made about the fiscal break-even level.
Yeah.
Now, Saudi, as the de facto leader of the OPEC Plus cartel, is essentially trying to keep oil prices at around or slightly above $80 a barrel, because that is where Saudi's fiscal break-even is. Now, for countries like the UAE, the fiscal break-even is lower. And of course, the UAE has just recently introduced corporate tax as well. So that will, again, reduce the government's dependence on oil and oil at a certain price point in order to pay for all of its commitments.
Yeah.
So, look, the whole thing is cyclical, as we've discussed. If OPEC can reduce production to maintain a price point, then that's great in terms of those countries being able to meet those financial commitments. But of course, selling less oil at a higher price still means less revenue. So ultimately, they are making a bit of a sacrifice in terms of ultimate total revenue in order to sustain an oil price that helps them to pay for what they need. So again, we will see those production cuts have an impact. I mean, take Saudi, for example. Last year, Saudi grew by 9%. It's the fastest growing economy in the G20. This year, because of those production cuts, Saudi's sacrificed growth. Saudi's growth this year will be zero, off the back of that 9% last year. So a peak last year and a trough this year. So yes, it's been painful for Saudi, but they will be able to unwind those production cuts next year, and hopefully, from their perspective, still benefit from a price point that means that volume times price means good income for Saudi, therefore good income for Kuwait.
Thank you so much, Mr. Robert.
You're welcome.
Hope to see you soon in Kuwait.
Me too.
And he has a flight.
I have a flight
You need to catch your flight.
Back to
Have a
Dubai.
safe flight, Mr.
Thank you.
Robert, and thank you again.
Super. Thank you very much.